Hi, good afternoon. My name is Danny Yuxin Huang. I am currently a postdoc at Princeton University. This is work I did with my PhD advisors at UC San Diego, Alex Noren and Kirill Levchenko, along with my colleague at NYU, Damon McCoy, as well as other researchers at UCSD, NYU, Chainalysis, and Google. So I'll talk about ransomware today. Ransomware is basically a kind of malware that encrypts your files, and to get your files back, you would typically have to pay bitcoins. As you might have heard from the news, ransomware has caused millions of dollars of damages to victims, and examples of victims include, say, hospitals or schools or even cities. The question is, how much money are these ransomware operators making? What is their revenue? And is there a way to take down these ransomware operations? Before we answer these questions, let me just walk you through a typical ransomware infection, from infection to payment. So the first step is distribution. Ransomware is distributed via conventional means such as spam, email, or compromised websites. Once the binary executes, it typically starts encrypting user files such as Word documents or images immediately. Once encryption is complete, the ransomware typically opens a new browser window to show the ransom note, which is basically instructions on how to pay the ransom. In a typical ransom note, there's usually a ransom amount. This amount varies from ransomware family to ransomware family over time. Examples include Cerberus, mean $1,000 ransom last year, or Lockheed's median $1,800 last year. In the ransom note, there's also a ransom wallet address. This is the Bitcoin wallet address that victims are supposed to pay into to get their files back. And this ransom wallet address is typically unique per victim, so that when a victim pays, the ransomware operator knows whether the victim has paid or not. A typical victim is unlikely to hold Bitcoin, so what he or she would do is she would take the fiat currency, such as dollars, and deposit that money into an exchange to purchase Bitcoins. And then the victim would move the Bitcoins to a ransom wallet address that is unique to his or hers. Upon receiving the payment, most of the time, the ransomware operator would decrypt the files. At this point, the Bitcoin ransom is in the hand of the ransomware operator. The ransomware operator may choose to cash out the Bitcoins, again, through an exchange to get back fiat currencies. So given this business model, we ask two broad research questions. First of all, economics. How do we estimate the total ransom paid by victims, or what is the revenue for the ransomware families? The second question is, we would like to facilitate the takedown of ransomware, but how do we identify choke points in the ransomware value chain? So here's a highlight of our results in the paper. We analyzed the blockchain, and we identified 10 different ransomware families. These 10 families made at least $16 million over the last 2 years. This revenue is not equally distributed across the 10 families. In fact, 90% of these $16 million were made by two families, Cerber and Lockheed, which I'll talk about later. For the Lockheed ransomware, 40% of its revenue was actually moved to a single exchange called BTCE for potential liquidation. This single exchange is a potential choke point for takedown. For the Cerber ransomware, we reverse engineered this command control protocol, and we found that 3% of the affiliates caused 50% of the infected IP addresses. Again, this 3% of affiliates is a potential choke point. The first two results is based on blockchain analysis, which I'll talk about in the first part of the talk. And the last result is based on reverse engineering of the communication protocol, which I'll talk about in the second part of the talk. So first of all, we analyzed the blockchain, and we estimated the revenue for 10 different ransomware families, and we identified potential points for liquidation. Our methodology basically follows the Bitcoin flow. It involves 4 different steps. In the first step, we identify the ransom wallet addresses of actual known victims. These are victims who actually made the payment to ransomware. This is the ground truth data set, basically. Using this ground truth data set, we infer the ransom wallet addresses of other unknown victims. And these 2 steps, we're able to collect a number of Bitcoin wallet addresses of victims. And we're able to look into the Bitcoin blockchain and estimate the total revenue for individual ransomware families. And finally, we look at the Bitcoin blockchain graph, and we follow the trail of Bitcoins, and we identify exchanges where ransomware operators potentially cashed out their Bitcoins. So this is the overall view of our methodology. So let's start with the first step. We identify known ransom wallet addresses from known victims. In particular, we look for instances of actual victims making ransom payments based on data sources such as forums or security company blogs or other proprietary data sources. So in this example, we have a known victim paying 0.5 Bitcoins into his or her unique ransom wallet address. But recall that this ransom wallet address is unique to this victim. How do we use this information to infer other victims? So the key observation is that once a ransom wallet address receives ransom payment, it moves the Bitcoin into some central wallet address along with payments from other wallet addresses. And typically, such transfer happen in the same single transaction. Effectively, the 3 wallet addresses on the left are the input of the same transaction. We call these 3 wallet addresses co-spending addresses, and we assume that these 3 wallet addresses belong to the same owner. Well, the exception is CoinJoin, which I'll talk about offline. But the key takeaway is that given that the first wallet address at the top, we know that it belongs to the ransomware operator, we can say that the other 2 wallet addresses also belong to the same ransomware operator. Does that mean that money going into these co-spending addresses are ransom payments? We can't really say that because a ransomware operator may receive Bitcoins from other non-ransomware related activities. So to identify ransomware related payments, we look at the payment amounts. So for these co-spending addresses, we look backwards. In the Bitcoin transaction graph, we look at the payment amounts. So we see a 1.0 Bitcoin payment and 1.3 Bitcoin payment. So which of it is Bitcoin is ransom payment? Well, we look at the exact amount. So say for instance, for the Lockheed ransomware, the Lockheed ransomware charges ransom in increments of 0.5 Bitcoins. So the 1.0 Bitcoin payment is likely to be a payment amount, whereas the 1.3 Bitcoin payment, we don't have confidence to say whether it is an actual, it is a ransom payment amount. So for the 1.0 Bitcoin payment, we say that it comes from a potential victim. So by doing this, from a known victim, we're able to identify wallet addresses of potential victims. This technique, however, is contingent upon the fact that we have some ground truth about actual victims making ransom payment. What if such ground truth is non-existent? In reality, for the Lockheed and Cerber ransomware that we studied, we initially did not have any actual reports of real victims paying. So what we did was we obtained the ransomware binary, executed it on a sandbox, and we infected ourselves. So we became the artificial victim. So the thing about artificial victim is that there's no Bitcoin payment. It's difficult to see the money flow. So what do? We make the ransom payment. So in this case, we made 0.001 Bitcoin payments, which at the point of experiment was about $10, to sort of kickstart the money flow. So once we start seeing the money flow, which is in the case of the server and Locky, which happily accepted our $10 worth of payment. We were able to use the same technique to see payments into these co-spanning addresses, and we were able to identify potential victims. In this way, we're able to obtain the ransom wallet addresses of real victims and potential victims. And using these addresses, we can look at the blockchain and estimate the revenue. So here's the result. This is a stack bar chart. Each individual bar corresponds to a month between 2014 and 2017. The height of each bar corresponds to monthly revenue per each ransomware family. If you look at the red, which is the Locky ransomware, it made more than $1 million in March 2016. If you look at the blue, which is the server ransomware, it's actively receiving payments for the longest periods of time based on our analysis. Here are the total revenue per ransomware family. The sum of these numbers is at least $16 million. Of these $16 million, the $14 million, which is about 90%, is made by Server and Locky. WannaCry, which you might have heard about on the news, only makes about $100,000 despite the media coverage. So far, we've talked about ransomware receiving, the bitcoins received by ransomware. What about bitcoins being cashed out? How much bitcoins were potentially cashed out, and where were they cashed out? So to answer these questions, we look at the Bitcoin blockchain. We identify wallet addresses that co-spent with wallet addresses of known exchanges. We look for Bitcoin flows from ransomware wallet addresses into exchanges. By looking at this connection, we can see movement of Bitcoins from ransomware into exchanges, where potentially the ransomware operators cashed out. And here's the result. On the y-axis are the 5 ransomware families that you just saw. On the x-axis is the fraction of revenue sent to exchanges. So the top one is WannaCry. We couldn't really identify the exchanges being used, but for Locky, the second one, we identified $2.6 million, which is about 40% of its revenue, that was moved into a single exchange called BTCE. Of particular note, BTCE was recently seized by law enforcement due to money laundering charges. As exchanges are getting more and more highly regulated, it is likely that ransomware operators will find it increasingly difficult to cash out their bitcoins. So far throughout the talk, I've talked about victims who actually made ransom payments. What about victims who were infected but never made the payments? In general, we're interested in infected computers, whether victims paid or not. To this end, we reverse engineered the command control protocol of one particular ransomware family called Server. What is special about Server is that every infected computer would behave like this. It will send out UDP packets about the infection to thousands of IP addresses, and some of these IP addresses are in the same /24. There's a command control server listening somewhere, but it never responds. So this design effectively hides the true IP address of the command control server. But this design has one advantage for us. We purchase one of the IP addresses, we get to listen to traffic from real infected devices for a 2-week period in February 2017. This traffic gives us information such as the victim's IP addresses, the victim's ID, the affiliate IDs per infection. So what is affiliate? So purportedly, Server runs the affiliate model, where the affiliates are in charge of distributing the ransomware binaries, whereas the affiliate program, which is Server, is in charge of maintaining the infrastructure, such as the payment infrastructure. The affiliates are getting paid based on the number of infections they make. So the affiliate ID is probably a way to keep track of how many infections there are for every affiliate. We can use this information to look at the number of infected IP addresses per affiliate. So here's a histogram on the x-axis. Is the affiliate IDs from 0 to 256 that we collected over a 2-week period. We truncated the x-axis to only 100. On the y-axis is the number of IP addresses infected per affiliate. The high-level takeaway is that half of the infected IP addresses are due to 3% of the affiliates, which in this case is 8 affiliates. So if you are the network operator or AV antivirus vendor, and if you were able to stop these 3% affiliates from infecting, then you would probably have stopped 50% of the infections from going on. In summary, we tracked ransomware end-to-end. We developed 2 methodologies. The first methodology looks at the first method tracks ransom payment for 10 ransomware families using co-spending wallet addresses. And the second method reverse engineers a command control protocol for the server ransomware to count the number of infections per affiliate. Using both of these methods, we are able to identify 10 ransomware families which made at least $16 million over 2 years, 90% of which were made by Cerber and Locky, these 2 ransomware families. And we identified 2 potential choke points, exchanges and affiliates. Network operators, AV vendors, regulators could potentially use these choke points to mitigate the damages of ransomware. My name is Danny Huang. I'm a postdoc at Princeton. And with this, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
So maybe one quick question. Looking into these Bitcoin transactions that you had, anything else interesting in those ledgers?
Anything else interesting in those ledgers?
Yeah, in terms of, let's say, questionable transactions.
Questionable is hard to say because we don't really have the ground truth, but what is interesting is here we only show the cashing out, potential cashing out, like money, Bitcoins going from ransomware to exchanges. What is interesting about what I did not show here is money going into the ransomware from exchanges. Those are potentially victims. And as shown on the paper, we saw most of the incoming Bitcoins into ransomware for one family came from Korean exchanges. So it suggests that potentially most of the victims were from South Korea. So these are some of the insights you can gain by looking at the Bitcoin transaction graph. Yeah, let's go ahead.
My name is Hillary Orman. I've been a member of the human race for several decades. I was curious about what you just alluded to. Does any of this give you insight into the source of the ransomware in the first place?
The source of ransomware, meaning who developed these ransomware families?
Who's behind distributing it?
No, we don't know anything about them. Even if we looked at the exchanges potentially used for cash out, we don't really know anything about the identities or locations of these ransomware operators.
Hey, Manuel Egele, Boston University. This is awesome. So I was wondering with your measurement with the $16 million figure that you see up there, there have been reports, I guess, prior to your study, I think in 2015 for CryptoBall raking in $300 million a year. So that's like 2 to 3 orders of magnitude off of what you're measuring here. Mm-hmm. Does this indicate that ransomware is actually becoming less and less of a problem because we're dropping by 3 orders of magnitude within 2 years?
So this number here is a lower bound. In particular, so if you look at the Bitcoin transaction graph, we identify payment as coming from ransomware by its exact amounts. In the previous few slides, like there's like 1.0 Bitcoins going to ransomware, and there's 1.3 Bitcoins going to ransomware. But we consider that 1.0 Bitcoins as ransomware revenue only, ignoring the 1.3 amount, because we couldn't find any indication that ransomware was charging 1.3 Bitcoins. Potentially that could be a real ransom amount, but we weren't sure. So we are effectively undercounting the ransom amount.
Hello, Everpis Paskevas from General Motors R&D. I have a question based on your measurements. Are you able to detect which infected hosts actually got back their data based on the decryption keys? In the sense, some effective ransomware characteristics, because you need to get back the data when you pay for the ransom, but there are reports that half of the victims, they didn't get back actually the data. So can you detect it with the measurements that you can do? Like, what are the effective ransomware characteristics that you have in this infected host from WannaCry and the other Cerber, etc.?
We're asking for a conversion rate.
No. I'm asking whether you are able to check whether the ransomware distributors were able to give the decryption keys and actually give back.
Oh, no.
No?
No.
So it's not part of your study at all?
No, it's not part of the study. We couldn't tell, like from our data, whether a ransomware can actually decrypt your files. But based on anecdotal evidence, we know that Locky and Cerber, they are honest in the sense that you pay, they decrypt. That's what
Last-
I heard.
This is not the
question.
truth.
So maybe we can take that offline and we'll take one more question and then
Yeah, I was just going to ask you a little more about the undercounting. Sorry, Patrick Trainer from Florida and CryptoDrop. Thank you, Peter. So one concern that I have is that through our observations, we see that depending who you are, depending what domain you come from, and especially given the volatility in the price of Bitcoin in the last 6 months especially, the prices that people were quoted, everywhere from 0.1 to 2 Bitcoins I've seen for a variety of different families. It seems like this, only the ones you could confirm seems like a kind of a strange methodology. 16 million seems very low. Any thoughts about why that approach? It certainly is conservative, and I agree it's a lower bound, but why is that a valid approach? It seems like you missed a lot based on my experience in the space, and I think that number should be a lot higher.
Again, without ground truth, we don't really know how much we miss. But here's one way to estimate how much we miss. Come on, click. All right. So one way to check how much we miss is we compare the blockchain data with other sources of data. That includes Google results and binaries found. So here we have the Locky ransomware. On the x-axis is from 2016, 2017. The lower band refers to the amount of Bitcoin payments. The redder it is, the more Bitcoin there is per day. Okay? The first line refers to how many Google searches, based on Google Trends there are, for the Locky ransomware. And the middle band refers to the number of binaries found, new binaries found active on VirusTotal that matches Locky's signatures. So you can see that the Bitcoin payment in the lower graph is continuous from February 2016 to about the end of 2016, and there's a gap afterwards. However, binaries were still found after the Bitcoin gap. So potentially, we were missing wallet addresses that we weren't able to see. So that is one way to visualize how much Bitcoin payment that we're potentially missing.
So maybe we can end here and you guys can have a debate outside about how big is the ransom market. Thank you so much, everybody, speakers and audience.
Thank you.